When we choose to follow the shepherd, we will find that in spite of the highs and the lows, in spite of the valleys of the shadow of death, in spite of the consequences to the mistakes and the choices we've made, and the benefits and the blessings, in spite of all of it, God is faithful. God's faithfulness is not dependent on my faithfulness. In Psalm 23, verse 6, "Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So, we're going to meet Miss Shirley Goodness today and mercy. We're looking at that and how these things will follow. Now, we sang the song, "Surely goodness and mercy will follow me." And in the NIV it says, "Surely your goodness and love will follow me." If you were to read the NASB or maybe your King James, it says, "Surely your goodness and loving kindness will follow me." And I think this is the piece that I want to dig down on a little bit. One, it's always a bit interesting preaching a poem. Okay, so the Psalms are poems, they're songs that were written, and they have a different literary style, and there's more artistic material, right? This is there's not just one way to say it. It's an image. He develops, it's a metaphor. So the psalmist is trying to tell us something about God and his experience with God. And he's trying to provide, Psalm 23 provides a song for the people of God to reflect on God's goodness and faithfulness. And this is where that comes through, is actually the word for love or mercy. Surely goodness and mercy, or surely your goodness and love, or loving kindness. The word is a Hebrew word that is the equivalent of agape. And this is the big deal, that surely your goodness and your covenant faithfulness will follow me all the days of my life. So it's not just love or mercy. Like when we think of mercy, we think of just being kind of kindness, right? Oh, they had mercy. They shared their dessert, or they gave him a hand, or they helped the person with the bill, or they did something nice. But this is not that. This is there's so much more meat to this. It's so much weightier than that. Surely your goodness and your covenant love, your covenant faithfulness will follow me all the days of my life. I feel like if we read it too quickly and we think mercy or love, it's too light. Oh, well, isn't that a nice thought? You're like, no, this has weight to it. The psalmist has been through some stuff, and he has recalled the goodness of God, and he's like, man, all the days of my life. And I think about it, this is attributed to David. I think about David's life, and if he's writing this toward the end of his life, perhaps it kind of started at the beginning. He was a shepherd in the fields, and he had an understanding of what that is, to be around, to lie down in green pastures. But we think about at the end of David's life and how he's reflecting on this. And I think this is the weight of like, wow, God, your goodness, your covenant faithfulness has followed me this far for some reason, and it will follow me all the rest of my days too. It will dwell all the rest of my days. And sometimes we want to read the dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Sometimes we think like going to heaven, but that's not really what he's inferring here. It's more about a returning to the place where we worship God. But it's God's covenant faithfulness that is what we wanted to dig into today. So as we think about David's life, we think about all of the ups and downs he's had. And when he's claiming that God has a covenant faithfulness, that is really, portraying something weighty to the audience. So God has a number of covenants that we find in the Bible. We have the Abrahamic covenant, where God covenants with Abraham and asks him to go to a land far away that he doesn't know. And that even though Abraham and Sarah, his wife, are very old, that he's actually going to give them children. And it's going to be his children and his offspring, and his family line is going to number more than the stars in the sky. And at first, Sarah laughs and doesn't believe. She doesn't believe that God could do this, or just like, she was old. She was in her 90s. You're telling me I'm going to have a baby? What? But God makes a covenant with Abraham, and sure enough, comes through on it. And out of that journey and out of that family become the nation of Israel. And it's multiplied. And then there's a covenant with Moses. After God leads the people, that whole Abraham's family became so big and prosperous that they took over Egypt in essence. But the Egyptians were afraid, and so they made them slaves because they said, "Oh, these Hebrews are going to take over. So we got to keep them as slaves." And they helped, build those ancient things in Egypt. And so then Moses comes along, and God uses Moses and Aaron to help set the people free from captivity, and God gives Moses the law. He gives the people the law through Moses. So this is the second covenant, where God says, look, if you'll be faithful and keep my laws, and keep what I'm telling you how to live. You guys don't know how to live as a society because you've been slaves for the last 400 years. But I'm going to tell you how I want you to live so that you can be my people and you can be set apart. And all the nations will know those are the people of Yahweh. Those are the people of God. And so God makes a covenant through the law with Moses and the Hebrews. They say, if I'll be your God, you'll be my people. And if you do these things, I will be faithful, and you'll see the fruit of this. And so there's that second covenant. But then there's a third covenant that God makes with David. And God basically tells David that there will be somebody from his family on the throne of Israel forever. Now, in David's life, he had a lot of ups and downs. And it's still one of those things that we often tell the famous stories of David, David and Goliath and these other things, David worshiping, and David was a man after God's own heart. But we cannot forget that David was also one of the more colorful guys. There was some adultery in there. There was some murder. Many of us have not hit that level in our sort of sin lives yet. Hopefully don't. But yet David continued to come back to the Good Shepherd. And there was this faithfulness that he found even when he had blown it, worse than most of us will ever blow it in our lives, God was faithful. Now here's the thing that I think is really important for us to note. That following the shepherd and even God's covenant faithfulness doesn't mean that everything is all sunshine and roses. And I know you've heard me say this before, but David's life is this example, okay? So because of David's affair with Bathsheba, that child that they had, died. So there was a consequence to David's actions, right? God didn't spare David from all heartache and everything. Even though there was this covenant with David, David had already been married and had kids, and now this whole thing happens, and yet David is pleading with the Lord, please, 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 let my son live. And he doesn't. So there were still consequences to David's actions. Those were not removed. Now, David still talks about the covenant faithfulness of God at the end of his life, but he suffered the consequences of his actions and of disobeying God. But it didn't mean that God wasn't faithful. Okay? And sometimes we need that reminder that in our lives, the paths of righteousness sometimes lead through the valley. In our lives, God's covenant faithfulness sometimes means correction. And we don't like that. Your kids don't like that. My kids don't like that. And if we're honest, we don't like that. That's when we tend to say, I don't want the shepherd. I shall not want. I like the shepherd when he's making me lie down in green pastures. I don't like the shepherd when he's using the rod and the staff. But I want to tell you that the discipline side of it is still part of God's covenant faithfulness. And we can't separate those two things out. We need to have both. You can see it in God's, throughout the whole Old Testament. As God is faithful through and through to his people, all the way from the covenant of Abraham. And he's faithful all the way through. After that, the other consequences for David. One of David's other sons ends up rebelling against him. And so David has to go on the run. Absalom decides the kingdom should be his. And so as David gets into his older years, instead of having a nice, happy retirement as the king of Israel, the most famous king of Israel, actually there's only been two at the time, but instead of having a nice, happy retirement, he's got to go on the run because his son is trying to overtake the throne. Well, God, that's not a happy retirement. Right? God, what happened? I know I made a mistake. My son died, and I thought we dealt with that. Now, I'm on the run from my own son. Talk about a predicament. David is not afraid. David's not afraid of anybody or anything, really. You can see that through his life. But what is he going to do? Is he going to attack his own son? Ambush him? Outwit him? Kill his own son? Or is he going to let his son run him off and take his life and take over the kingdom? I mean, that's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it? Talk about a rock and a hard place. You've had some problems with your kids. Ooh, none like that. Right? And so David is still, even in his older years, wrestling with some of the consequences and some of the things that have happened earlier. But your goodness and covenant love and covenant faithfulness will follow me all the days, even when I'm running away from my son who's trying to kill me. He could still claim God's faithfulness. He could still look ahead to the promise of what God had in store for him. Now, after that, we find in the story of David that Solomon, actually, another one of his sons, does become king. And Solomon goes forward and he's able to build the temple. That's something David had really wanted to do to honor God. But God said, no, you have too much blood on your hands. You've fought too many battles, killed too many people. We're going to leave this temple building to someone else. So David helped plan it. He helped finance it. But then it was his other son, Solomon, who actually built the temple. However, after Solomon, the kingdom is divided. And you get two separate kingdoms that start to come out. And you have the north, you have Israel, and in the south you have Judah. And so you have 10 tribes in the north and 2 tribes in the south. And you have this divided kingdom. And in the north they had different kings and different people rotating through. And if you were to read through that, the Kings and Chronicles, you see what happens. And it talks about, and another king rose up and did evil in the sight of the Lord. And then another king rose up and did evil in the sight of the Lord. So on and so forth. Now, in the southern kingdom, in Jerusalem, there was always a family member of David on that throne. And so we do have that God's covenant faithfulness carried through the southern kingdom. But in the end, in 586, the first kingdom in the north collapsed in 722, and the second kingdom collapsed in 586, and then there was no king. And so, well, what happened? God, I thought your covenant faithfulness was going to be thorough all the days of my life. So it did for David, but what happened to this promise that God made David, that there would always be somebody from David's line on the throne? Well, that's where we fast forward to the New Testament. And if we look at the beginning of Matthew, we find the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. And in verse 6, it says, "And Jesse was the father of King David, and David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife." And if you were to keep going on and going on, you would find that Jacob is the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. And so we find that through the line of David, and is traced through Joseph, that actually Jesus is from the line of David. And so Jesus, the King of the universe, the one who we sang earlier, "Build your kingdom here," is on the throne. The King of kings and the Lord of lords is from the line of David. And so God's covenant faithfulness has brought us through to the person of Jesus Christ, who then established the last covenant through his death on the cross to pay for the sins of the world, and his resurrection to show the power of God. We now have a new covenant with God, that all have access to God who would receive the gift of salvation, that forgiveness that Jesus offers. And so we too can read this verse and say, "Surely your goodness and covenant faithfulness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." From these verses that David wrote so many years ago, we find God's faithfulness has been true. His covenant faithfulness true through the days and the months and the years and the decades and the century and the millennia. And God's covenant faithfulness is still at work. And sometimes, even though we are the recipients of this, and even though there's tough times, and even though there's valleys of darkness, and even though there's consequences for our sins, God's covenant faithfulness does not stop. And that's the encouragement that I want to give you today, to say, this verse is so much weightier. There's so much more behind it than we first realize when we just say, "Surely goodness and mercy will follow me." It's so much more. Surely God's goodness and his covenant faithfulness will follow me all the days of my life. And so for all of our days, when we serve Jesus, when we follow him, when we choose, like we learned in the first week, when we choose to follow the shepherd, we will find that in spite of the highs and the lows, in spite of the valleys of the shadow of death, in spite of the consequences to the mistakes and the choices we've made, and the benefits and the blessings, in spite of all of it, God is faithful. God is faithful. And we can take comfort in that, in knowing that God's faithfulness is not dependent on my faithfulness. God's faithfulness is not dependent on my strength or my ability to walk the straight and narrow. God's faithfulness is so much bigger and better than that. It makes up for all of my failings, all of my weakness. And I love how this whole Psalm 23, just shows how much God takes initiative when it comes to those he loves, to his people, to his creation. "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me." So he makes me do this. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. God is taking the initiative to do these things. After that, he guides me along right paths. He's with me. He comforts me. He prepares a table for me. He anoints my head with oil and honors me. And then I have surely goodness chasing me down, and God's covenant faithfulness all the days of my life. And they'll follow me. And I think of that, there's a poem called The Hound of Heaven. And it's a powerful image, almost as God as a bit of a hound dog, as far as the kindness and the covenant faithfulness of God. And even when this guy makes bad choices, even when he doesn't want God, even when he goes down the dark valleys and the dark streets and the alleys and makes choices that are just taking his life down in the gutter, God's faithfulness sniffs him out. You can find him. The hound of heaven. Sorry, you didn't get lost. I know you tried to. You tried to get lost. You tried to leave me behind. I'm still here. God's covenant faithfulness, you can't shake it. Surely goodness and His faithfulness, His covenant faithfulness, His covenant love, His loving kindness, His mercy will pursue you. Will pursue you. Will hunt you down and tackle you. I don't know if you remember cartoon Marmaduke. There was a cartoon I used to read. It had a giant, like a mastiff dog that was always getting into trouble. Now that I have a dog, I get it a little more. But the dog would just come and just bowl over the owners, and you couldn't do anything about it. And just slurp and slobber and just love the owner. And that's kind of what I picture when I think about this. Surely goodness and God's covenant love, it's coming for you. So stop running. Just get tackled. You know what that's like, right? Just get tackled by it and let God's covenant mercy and love overwhelm you.